The morning sun peeked through the windows of the small courthouse, bathing the room in a warm golden glow. Justice of the Peace. Harold Simmons sat at his desk, sipping a cup of coffee as he reviewed the day's schedule. The courthouse was nestled in the heart of a quiet little town, where everyone knew each other's names and life moved at a leisurely pace. It was one of those places where people valued tradition, kindness, and community above all else. For nearly 30 years, Harold had been an integral part of this town, officiating weddings, settling minor disputes, and offering sage advice to anyone who sought it. He wasn't just a public servant. He was a trusted figure, someone whose judgment people respected. Today, however, Harold couldn't shake off a strange feeling that lingered in the back of his mind. Perhaps it was because there was something unusual about today's wedding. The couple getting married, Emily Carter and David Monroe, weren't regulars in town. Emily was well known here, having grown up among these streets, but David was an outsider, someone no one seemed to know much about. That alone wasn't enough to raise suspicion, but Harold had learned over the years to trust his instincts, and right now they were whispering warnings he couldn't ignore. As the clock ticked closer to noon, the courthouse began filling up with guests. Emily's family and friends trickled in, chatting animatedly and exchanging hugs. They carried bouquets of flowers, balloons, and cameras, eager to capture every moment of what was supposed to be a joyous occasion. Despite their excitement, Harold noticed subtle signs of tension in some of the attendees. A few whispered nervously to one another, glancing toward the entrance as if waiting for something or someone to arrive. Others exchanged uneasy looks when certain topics came up in conversation. Harold tried not to jump to conclusions, reminding himself that weddings often brought out mixed emotions in people. Still, he couldn't help but wonder if there was more beneath the surface. Finally, the bride and groom arrived. Emily walked into the room first, her face glowing with happiness. She wore a simple yet elegant white dress adorned with lace, and her hair was styled in soft curls. Her cheeks flushed pink as she greeted her loved ones, hugging them tightly and laughing at their jokes. There was no denying how radiant she looked, brimming with excitement about starting this new chapter of her life. Yet, as Harold watched her closely, he detected a flicker of nervousness in her eyes, a fleeting shadow that disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. Then came David. Tall and sharply dressed in a tailored suit, he exuded confidence as he entered the room. On the surface, he seemed like the perfect match for Emily. Handsome, polished, and charismatic. But Harold couldn't shake the nagging sense that something wasn't quite right. Unlike Emily, whose smile lit up the entire room, David's expression remained guarded. His lips curled upward in what might have passed for a smile, but it lacked warmth. Instead of meeting the gazes of the guests, his eyes darted around the room restlessly, as though scanning for potential threats. When he finally turned to Emily, his smile didn't reach his eyes. It was a small detail, easy to miss, but Harold had spent decades observing human behavior. To him, it stood out like a crack in an otherwise flawless painting. Harold's unease deepened as he reflected on his role in the ceremony. As a justice of the peace, his job wasn't merely to recite lines from a script or sign marriage certificates. He saw himself as a guardian of sorts, ensuring that the unions he officiated were built on solid foundations of love, trust, and mutual respect. Over the years, he had witnessed countless couples exchange vows, their faces alight with genuine affection and hope for the future. But he had also seen darker sides of relationships, cases where one partner dominated the other, manipulating them into decisions they weren't fully comfortable with. Those experiences had taught him to pay attention to even the smallest red flags, no matter how insignificant they might seem. As the minutes ticked by and the ceremony drew nearer, Harold found himself replaying snippets of conversations he had overheard earlier. Some of Emily's relatives had expressed concerns about the haste with which the wedding had been planned. "It feels rushed," one aunt had murmured to another. "I thought they'd take more time." Another guest had remarked on how rarely David visited Emily's hometown, despite being engaged for months. "Maybe he's just busy with work," Someone had replied defensively, but the remark stuck in Harold's mind nonetheless. Despite his growing apprehension, Harold reminded himself not to jump to conclusions. After all, appearances could be deceiving, and he owed it to both Emily and David to approach the situation with fairness and objectivity. Still, as he rose from his chair and made his way to the front of the room, his thoughts swirled with unanswered questions. Was David's aloofness simply a case of pre-wedding jitters? Or was there something deeper lurking beneath the surface? Only time would tell, but Harold resolved to remain vigilant. If there was even the slightest chance that Emily was entering this marriage under duress, it was his responsibility to intervene. Little did he know, the events of the next hour would test his resolve and change lives forever. The room was alive with anticipation as the ceremony began. Guests settled into their seats, adjusting ties and smoothing dresses while exchanging excited whispers. The soft rustle of fabric and the occasional giggle filled the air, creating an atmosphere of warmth and celebration. Justice of the peace. Harold Simmons stood at the front of the room, his posture upright but relaxed, projecting the calm authority that had earned him so much respect over the years. He glanced at Emily, who stood beside David, her hands clasped tightly around her bouquet. Her eyes sparkled with a mix of excitement and nerves, though she tried to appear composed. Beside her, David shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his fingers drumming lightly against his thigh. A gesture so subtle that only someone paying close attention would notice. Harold cleared his throat and began the ceremony, his voice steady and warm. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls," he started, reciting the familiar words that had been spoken countless times before in this very room. As he continued, his gaze moved between Emily and David, observing their reactions. Emily's expression softened as she listened, her lips curving into a genuine smile whenever Harold mentioned love or commitment. She leaned slightly toward David, seeking connection, her body language radiating hope and affection. But when Harold turned his attention to David, the contrast was striking. While David nodded politely and offered what appeared to be rehearsed responses, his demeanor remained distant. His answers were clipped, almost mechanical, lacking the emotional depth one might expect from someone about to embark on such a significant journey. It wasn't just David's tone that caught Harold's attention, it was the way he carried himself. His shoulders were tense, his jaw clenched ever so slightly, as if he were bracing for something. When Harold paused briefly to allow Emily to adjust her veil, David glanced around the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the guests. For a moment, they lingered on a group of Emily's relatives sitting near the front, their expressions bright with encouragement. Instead of smiling back, David's brow furrowed and he quickly looked away. It was a fleeting reaction, but it spoke volumes to Harold, who had spent decades interpreting nonverbal cues. Something about David's behavior suggested discomfort, or worse, unease, though Harold couldn't yet pinpoint why. As the ceremony progressed, Harold became increasingly attuned to the dynamics between the couple. There was a palpable imbalance in how they interacted. Emily frequently sought out David's gaze, her movements gentle and inviting. She reached for his hand once, squeezing it lightly as if to reassure him, but David pulled away almost imperceptibly. He didn't return the gesture or meet her eyes, instead focusing intently on Harold as though trying to anticipate his next words. This lack of reciprocity tugged at Harold's instincts, making him wonder whether Emily's feelings were truly being reciprocated, or even acknowledged. Then came a moment that solidified Harold's suspicions. Midway through the vows, David leaned toward Emily to whisper something under his breath. Harold couldn't hear the exact words, but he saw Emily's reaction immediately. Her smile faltered and her shoulders tensed as though she'd been struck by an unexpected chill. She blinked rapidly, clearly trying to compose herself, before nodding stiffly and forcing a smile back onto her face. To the casual observer, the exchange might have seemed innocuous, a private joke or a harmless remark, but Harold knew better. Having presided over hundreds of weddings, he understood the nuances of human interaction. What he witnessed wasn't playful banter, it was control masked as communication. This wasn't the first time Harold had encountered such dynamics during a wedding. Years ago, he had officiated a ceremony where the bride later confided in him that she hadn't wanted to go through with the marriage but felt trapped. At the time, Harold had missed the warning signs, dismissing his gut feeling as mere paranoia. The memory still haunted him, serving as a reminder of the weight of his responsibilities. Weddings weren't just formalities, they were promises, commitments meant to last a lifetime. If either party entered into them unwillingly or under duress, the consequences could be devastating. Determined not to repeat past mistakes, Harold resolved to dig deeper. After finishing another section of the ceremony, Harold paused and addressed the couple directly. "Before we proceed," he said calmly, his tone measured yet firm, "I'd like to ask you both a few personal questions. These aren't part of the standard process, but I believe they're important." The room fell silent, the cheerful energy replaced by a sense of curiosity, and perhaps a hint of apprehension. Emily looked up at Harold, her wide eyes reflecting surprise. She nodded slowly, her grip tightening on her bouquet. David, on the other hand, stiffened visibly, his hands balling into fists at his sides. His forced smile faded, replaced by a look of irritation that he struggled to conceal. Harold pressed on, unfazed by David's reaction. "Emily," he began, turning to the bride, "can you tell me what made you decide to marry David?" Emily hesitated for a split second, glancing at David before answering. When she spoke, her voice was soft but sincere. She talked about how they had met at a mutual friends gathering, bonding over shared interests and dreams for the future. She described David as kind and supportive, someone who had always encouraged her to pursue her goals. Her words painted a picture of a loving relationship, one built on trust and understanding. Yet, as she spoke, Harold noticed a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, a brief pause before certain phrases, as though she were carefully choosing her words. When it was David's turn to answer, the difference was stark. Asked the same question, David responded vaguely, offering generic statements about compatibility and timing. His tone was flat, devoid of the passion or enthusiasm one might expect from someone about to commit to a lifelong partnership. When Harold probed further, asking about specific moments that had strengthened their bond, David grew visibly uncomfortable. He shifted his weight again, avoiding eye contact and mumbling responses that lacked conviction. It was clear he hadn't anticipated these questions, or perhaps hadn't prepared for them at all. Throughout this exchange, Harold kept a close watch on Emily. Though she maintained her composure, there were subtle signs of distress. Her breathing quickened slightly and she fidgeted with the stems of her bouquet. She stole glances at David, searching for reassurance, but found none. Instead, David's demeanor grew colder, his earlier attempts at charm giving way to thinly veiled impatience. The disconnect between them was undeniable, and Harold's instincts screamed louder than ever that something was profoundly wrong. By the time Harold concluded his questioning, the mood in the room had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a joyful celebration now carried an undertone of tension, the kind that made people shift uncomfortably in their seats and exchange wary glances. Harold knew he had crossed a line, one that many might consider inappropriate, but he also knew he couldn't ignore what he had seen. Love, he believed, should be free, unforced, and mutual. Anything less was a betrayal of the vows he was tasked with upholding. As he prepared to make a decision that would alter the course of the day, and perhaps the lives of those involved, he reminded himself of the importance of his role. Today, he wasn't just a justice of the peace. He was a protector of truth and integrity. The tension in the room was palpable as Harold's questions lingered in the air, unanswered. Emily stood frozen, her fingers nervously twisting the stems of her bouquet until they bent slightly under the pressure. Her wide eyes darted between Harold and David, searching for some kind of reassurance or explanation. She had come into this day expecting joy and celebration, not scrutiny and unease. Yet deep down, a part of her seemed to recognize that something wasn't quite right, something she had been trying to push aside for weeks, maybe even months. Now, with Harold's probing questions forcing the issue to the surface. She couldn't ignore it any longer. David, on the other hand, was visibly irritated. His earlier attempts at charm had dissolved completely, replaced by a rigid posture and a clenched jaw. He crossed his arms tightly over his chest as if trying to shield himself from the spotlight. When Harold asked him directly about why he wanted to marry Emily, David hesitated, his lips parting but no words coming out. For a brief moment he looked like a cornered animal, unsure whether to fight or flee. Finally he forced a laugh, a brittle, hollow sound, and muttered, "Isn't it obvious? We're in love." The statement fell flat, lacking conviction and sincerity. Even Emily flinched at the tone of his voice, which carried an edge that made the hairs on the back of Harold's neck stand up. Harold didn't let the awkwardness deter him. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his expression calm but resolute. "Love is a beautiful thing," he said gently, addressing both Emily and David. "But it's also one of the most important decisions you'll ever make. I've seen too. Many people rush into marriages without truly understanding what they're committing to, or worse, feeling pressured into saying yes. My job isn't just to officiate ceremonies. It's to ensure that both of you are entering this union willingly and wholeheartedly." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry. She glanced at David again, her gaze filled with confusion and uncertainty. For years she had dreamed of this day, the perfect dress, the supportive family, the man she thought loved her unconditionally. But now, standing here under the weight of Harold's questions, those dreams felt shaky, almost fragile. A memory flashed through her mind. A conversation she'd had with David just days before the wedding. He had insisted they needed to finalize plans quickly because waiting would only cause problems. At the time, she had dismissed his urgency as excitement, but now she wondered if there had been another motive behind his insistence. Encouraged by the flicker of doubt in Emily's eyes, Harold decided to take a more direct approach. Turning to her, he softened his tone even further. "Emily," he began, "this is your special day, and I want to make sure it reflects exactly what you want, not what anyone else expects of you. Do you feel ready to take this step today?" The question was simple, yet its implications were profound. It gave Emily permission to pause, to reflect, and most importantly, to speak her truth without fear of judgment or backlash. For a long moment, Emily didn't respond. Her breath hitched and tears welled up in her eyes as conflicting emotions swirled inside her. On one hand, she loved David, or at least she thought she did. They had shared good times together, moments that had convinced her he was the person she wanted to spend her life with. But on the other hand, there were the doubts she had buried so deeply, doubts about his temper when things didn't go his way, his tendency to dismiss her opinions, and the subtle ways he manipulated her into agreeing with him. She had told herself those issues weren't deal breakers, that every relationship had challenges. But now, faced with Harold's gentle yet persistent questioning, she realized how much she had been ignoring her own feelings to keep the peace. David, sensing that Emily was wavering, stepped in quickly. "Of course she's ready," he interjected, his voice sharp and defensive. "Why wouldn't she be? We've talked about this 1,000 times. He shot Harold a glare, his patience clearly wearing thin. "This isn't an interrogation. We're here to get married, not answer 20 questions. Harold met David's glare with unwavering calm. "I understand your frustration," he replied evenly, "but my priority is making sure both of you are comfortable moving forward. If there's any hesitation, it's better to address it now than later." His gaze shifted back to Emily, encouraging her to continue. "Take your time, Emily. Whatever you're feeling is valid and you have the right to express it." Emily hesitated, her hands trembling as she clutched her bouquet. She could feel David's eyes boring into her, willing her to stay silent, to play along as she always had. But something inside her stirred, a spark of courage she hadn't known existed. Slowly she raised her head and looked at Harold. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that silenced the entire room. I don't know," she admitted, her words faltering. "I thought I was ready, but..." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, but the meaning was clear. The room collectively held its breath. Guests exchanged stunned glances, unsure of how to react. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned forward, hanging on every word. Emily's mother, seated near the front, pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. She had suspected something was off about David for a while, but hadn't wanted to interfere. Now, seeing her daughter finally acknowledge her doubts, she felt a mix of relief and heartbreak. David's reaction was immediate and explosive. "What do you mean you don't know?" he snapped, his voice rising sharply. He turned to Emily, grabbing her arm in a way that made several guests gasp audibly. "We've already planned everything, you can't just back out now." His grip tightened and Emily winced, instinctively pulling away. The movement was slight but noticeable, and Harold's eyes narrowed dangerously. "That's enough," Harold said firmly, stepping between them. His voice was calm but authoritative, leaving no room for argument. No one should ever be forced into anything they aren't comfortable with, and certainly not marriage. He placed a protective hand on Emily's shoulder, guiding her gently, away from David. "Emily, if you need a moment to think, we can pause the ceremony. Your feelings matter more than anything else right now." Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in months, maybe even years, she allowed herself to prioritize her own needs over keeping the peace. She took a step back, putting distance between herself and David, who looked increasingly agitated. His earlier composure had crumbled entirely, revealing a side of him that none of the guests had seen before. Gone was the charming, confident man who had walked into the courthouse earlier that day. In his place stood someone angry, frustrated, and desperate to regain control. As the reality of the situation sank in, whispers rippled through the room. Some guests murmured words of support for Emily, while others stared at David with growing suspicion. One of Emily's cousins stood up, her arms crossed defiantly, and said loudly, "If she doesn't want to do this, then she shouldn't have, too." Her boldness emboldened others, and soon, a chorus of voices joined in, urging Emily to trust her instincts. Harold watched silently as the tide turned against David. He knew the decision ultimately rested with Emily, but he also understood the power of community. These were her people, her family and friends who loved her unconditionally and wanted only the best for her. Their support gave her strength, allowing her to take another step back from David. She wiped her tears with trembling hands and whispered, "I'm sorry. I can't do this." The words were quiet but firm, echoing through the room like a thunderclap. David opened his mouth to protest, but the look on Harold's face stopped him cold. The justice of the peace stood tall, his presence commanding respect and authority. "Then we won't proceed," Harold declared, his voice steady and final. "A marriage must be built on mutual consent and trust. Without those, it has no foundation." With that, the ceremony came to an abrupt halt. Guests began filing out of the room, some comforting Emily while others cast disapproving glances at David. As for Harold, he stayed behind, ensuring Emily felt safe and supported. Though the day hadn't unfolded as anyone had expected, he knew he had done the right thing. Love, after all, wasn't supposed to hurt. It was meant to heal, uplift, and empower. And for Emily, this was the first step toward reclaiming her freedom. The courthouse room, once filled with the hopeful hum of celebration, now felt heavy with tension and raw emotion. Emily stood trembling, her white dress a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside her. Her tears flowed freely now, but they weren't just tears of sadness. They were also tears of liberation. For so long she had carried the weight of doubt and fear, burying it beneath layers of obligation and guilt. Now, in this moment, she finally allowed herself to confront those feelings head-on. It was as if a dam had burst within her, releasing years of pent-up emotions she hadn't fully acknowledged until that day. David, on the other hand, looked like a man whose world was unraveling before his eyes. His earlier attempts at charm and control had dissolved into anger and desperation. He paced back and forth near the front of the room, running his fingers through his hair and muttering under his breath. Occasionally, He shot accusatory glances at Harold, blaming him for derailing what he viewed as a perfect plan. "This is ridiculous," he exclaimed, his voice rising sharply. "You're ruining everything." She said yes. She agreed to this. Harold remained unfazed, standing firmly between David and Emily. His calm demeanor served as a shield, protecting Emily from David's escalating frustration. "Emily didn't say yes today," Harold corrected gently but firmly. "She said she wasn't sure, and that uncertainty speaks volumes. Marriage isn't something you force or rush into. It's a choice made freely by both parties." His words were measured, intended not only to reassure Emily but also to remind David and everyone else in the room that love should never come at the cost of personal freedom. As the reality of the situation settled over the guests, whispers turned into murmurs of support for Emily. Her mother rushed to her side, wrapping her arms around her daughter and pulling her close. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, stroking Emily's hair. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for. We're here for you." Friends followed suit, forming a protective circle around Emily, offering tissues, hugs, and words of encouragement. One of her bridesmaids even joked lightly, "Well, I guess we'll have to eat all that cake ourselves now." The comment drew nervous laughter from the group, easing some of the tension. Meanwhile, David's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He stopped pacing and instead fixed his gaze on Emily, his expression shifting from anger to pleading. "Come on, Em," he said, his tone softening as he tried a different tactic. "We've been through so much together. Don't let one little hiccup ruin everything we've built. You know how much I care about you." His voice cracked slightly, and for a moment he almost sounded sincere. But Emily, bolstered by the support of her loved ones, saw through the act. She shook her head slowly, her resolve strengthening with each passing second. "I'm sorry, David," she said, her voice steadier than it had been moments ago, "but I can't ignore how I feel anymore. This isn't right." Her words hung in the air, cutting through the lingering tension like a knife. There was no malice in her tone, only a quiet determination to honor her own truth. It was a turning point not just for Emily, but for everyone who witnessed it. David's face hardened again, the mask of vulnerability slipping away to reveal the same coldness Harold had noticed earlier. "Fine," he spat, throwing up his hands in exasperation. "Do whatever you want. Clearly none of you understand what's best for you." With that, he stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed loudly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. For a few seconds, no one moved or spoke, as if collectively processing what had just happened. Once the initial shock wore off, the atmosphere began to shift. Guests exchanged relieved smiles, grateful that Emily had found the courage to speak her mind. Some approached her to offer heartfelt words of support, while others helped gather her belongings and prepare for the next steps. A few volunteers stayed behind to clean up the decorations, their cheerful chatter filling the room with a sense of renewal. Despite the abrupt end to the ceremony, there was an undeniable feeling of hope in the air, a belief that Emily's decision marked the beginning of something better. Harold watched silently from the sidelines, observing the transformation taking place. He had seen many weddings throughout his career, but none quite like this one. What had started as a routine ceremony had become a pivotal moment of self-discovery for Emily, and perhaps for others in attendance as well. As people filed out of the courthouse, several stopped to thank Harold for his role in halting the wedding. "You did the right thing," one older gentleman told him, patting him on the shoulder. That poor girl needed someone to stand up for her. Though Harold appreciated the praise, he knew his actions weren't about heroics. They were about doing what was fair and just, ensuring that both parties entered into marriage willingly and without coercion. Still, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that Emily had been given the chance to reclaim her autonomy. Love, he believed, should empower people, not imprison them. And for Emily, Today was proof that she deserved nothing less than a relationship built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Later that evening, after the courthouse had emptied and the last remnants of the day's events had been cleared away, Harold sat alone in his office. He leaned back in his chair, reflecting on the whirlwind of emotions he had witnessed. While the outcome hadn't been what anyone had expected, it reinforced his belief in the importance of listening to one's instincts. Over the years, he had learned that happiness wasn't always found in following tradition or meeting expectations. It often required breaking free from them. As he packed up his things to head home, Harold paused to glance at a framed photo on his desk. It was a picture of him and his late wife, taken on their own wedding day decades ago. In the photo, they both radiated joy, their faces glowing with the kind of love that inspired stories and songs. Harold smiled softly, reminded of why he had dedicated his life to officiating weddings in the first place. Love, when nurtured properly, had the power to transform lives, but when forced or manipulated, it could leave scars that took years to heal. With that thought in mind, Harold turned off the lights and locked the courthouse door behind him. The town was quiet now, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Somewhere out there, Emily was beginning a new chapter, one defined not by fear or obligation, but by courage and self-respect. And though the road ahead might be uncertain, Harold knew she would walk it with her head held high, surrounded by people who truly cared about her. For now, that was enough. In the days that followed the Halted wedding, Emily's life underwent a profound transformation. The initial shock of calling off the ceremony gave way to a wave of emotions: relief, sadness, fear, and ultimately, empowerment. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe freely, unburdened by the weight of expectations and pressures she had been carrying. Her family and friends rallied around her, offering unwavering support as she navigated this unexpected chapter of her life. They reminded her constantly that she had done the right thing, even when doubts crept into her mind late at night. Emily spent much of her time reflecting on the events leading up to the wedding. She replayed conversations with David in her head, piecing together moments that now seemed glaringly obvious in hindsight. There was the time he insisted they move their wedding date forward because waiting would only complicate things. Then there were the arguments where his tone shifted from persuasive to domineering whenever she expressed hesitation about anything. At the time, she had dismissed these instances as minor disagreements or signs of stress. Now she realized they were red flags she had ignored out of fear of disappointing him, or worse, losing him altogether. Her mother played a crucial role during this period of self-discovery. One evening, over cups of tea in the cozy kitchen of Emily's childhood home, her mother gently encouraged her to open up. "You know, sweetheart," she began, stirring sugar into her mug, "it takes strength to admit when something isn't right, and it takes even more courage to walk away from it. What you did that day, it wasn't easy, but it was brave." Her words resonated deeply with Emily, who had been struggling with feelings of guilt and failure. Hearing her mother validate her decision helped ease some of the lingering doubts in her mind. As the days passed, Emily found solace in reconnecting with herself. She revisited hobbies she had neglected while planning the wedding: painting, reading, and taking long walks in the park. These activities brought her a sense of peace and clarity, allowing her to focus on what truly mattered: her own happiness and well-being. She also sought professional counseling, recognizing the importance of processing her emotions in a healthy way. During her sessions, she unpacked years of insecurities and learned how to set boundaries, a skill she realized she desperately needed moving forward. Meanwhile, news of the Halted wedding spread throughout the small town. Word traveled quickly, as it often does in close-knit communities, and soon everyone seemed to have an opinion about what had happened. Some praised Harold for his quick thinking and moral integrity, hailing him as a hero who had saved Emily from a potentially toxic marriage. Others criticized him, accusing him of overstepping his role as justice of the peace and interfering in private matters. But regardless of where people stood on the issue, one thing was certain: the story sparked important conversations about relationships, consent, and the pressures surrounding weddings. For many residents, the incident served As a wake-up call, friends and neighbors began sharing their own experiences of navigating difficult relationships or feeling trapped in situations they didn't want to be in. A local cafe became an unofficial meeting spot for these discussions, with patrons swapping stories over coffee and pastries. Even Harold found himself drawn into these conversations whenever he visited the cafe for his morning latte. People approached him to express gratitude or simply to thank him for reminding them that love should never come at the cost of personal freedom. David, on the other hand, disappeared from the town almost as quickly as he had arrived. After storming out of the courthouse that fateful day, he returned briefly to pack his belongings before leaving without explanation. No one knew where he went or what became of him, and frankly, few cared to find out. His abrupt departure left unanswered questions, but for Emily it was a blessing in disguise. Without his presence looming over her, she felt freer than ever to explore who she was outside the shadow of their relationship. Though David's absence provided closure in some ways, it also forced Emily to confront uncomfortable truths about herself. In therapy, she explored why she had stayed in the relationship for so long despite her growing unease. She came to understand that part of her reluctance to leave stemmed from a deep-seated fear of being alone. Growing up, she had always dreamed of finding the one and building a picture-perfect life together. When David entered her world, charming and confident, she convinced herself he was the answer to all her hopes and dreams. It wasn't until she hit rock bottom that she realized how much she had sacrificed along the way. Her independence, her voice, and most importantly, her sense of self-worth. Despite the challenges she faced, Emily refused to let bitterness take root in her heart. Instead, she channeled her energy into growth and healing. She started journaling as a form of self-expression, pouring her thoughts and feelings onto paper each night before bed. Writing became a therapeutic outlet, helping her process her emotions and gain perspective. She also reconnected with old friends she had drifted apart from during her time with David, rediscovering the joy of meaningful connections built on mutual respect and trust. One of the most significant changes in Emily's life came when she decided to volunteer at a local women's shelter. Inspired by her own journey, she wanted to help others facing similar struggles. The shelter offered resources and support to women escaping abusive relationships, providing them with tools to rebuild their lives. Emily found purpose in listening to their stories, offering encouragement and sharing her own experiences to let them know they weren't alone. It was a humbling reminder of how far she had come, and how much farther she still had to go. Back at the courthouse, Harold continued his work as Justice of the Peace, officiating weddings and settling disputes with the same dedication and wisdom that had defined his career for decades. Yet the memory of Emily's wedding lingered in his mind, serving as both a source of pride and a cautionary tale. He knew not every situation would end as dramatically or decisively as hers, but he remained committed to trusting his instincts and prioritizing the well-being of those involved. To him, justice wasn't just about following rules. It was about doing what was fair, compassionate, and right. The townspeople, too, carried the lessons of that day with them. Conversations about love, respect, and consent became more commonplace, encouraging individuals to reflect on their own relationships and values. For some, it sparked difficult but necessary discussions with partners or loved ones. For others, it reinforced the importance of standing up for oneself and seeking help when needed. Slowly but surely, the ripple effects of Harold's decision spread throughout the community, fostering a culture of empathy and understanding. As weeks turned into months, Emily emerged stronger and more resilient than ever before. She no longer viewed the halted wedding as a failure, but as a turning point, a moment of clarity that had redirected her path toward a brighter future. Though scars remained, they served as reminders of her strength and perseverance. And while she didn't know what lay ahead, she faced it with hope, optimism, and a renewed belief in her ability to create a life filled with authenticity and joy. In the end, the halted wedding wasn't just a story about stopping a marriage, it was a testament to the power of courage, community, and second chances. It proved that sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the greatest opportunities for growth. And for Emily, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one written entirely on her own terms. Months had passed since the day Emily's wedding was halted, and the small town continued to buzz with quiet admiration for her courage. Life moved forward, as it always does, but the ripple effects of that pivotal moment lingered in unexpected ways. For Emily, the journey wasn't easy. It was filled with challenges, self-discovery, and moments of triumph. But she emerged stronger than ever, ready to embrace a future defined by authenticity and self-respect. Emily's transformation was evident to everyone who knew her. Gone was the hesitant young woman who had once second-guessed every decision, replaced by someone confident and radiant. She no longer sought validation from others or allowed fear to dictate her choices. Instead, she focused on nurturing herself, mentally, emotionally, and physically. Her mornings began with meditation and journaling, practices she had adopted during her recovery process. These rituals helped her stay grounded and connected to her inner voice, something she now valued above all else. Her volunteer work at the women's shelter became a cornerstone of her new life. What started as an attempt to give back soon turned into a passion project. Emily found immense fulfillment in mentoring women who were rebuilding their lives after leaving toxic relationships. She listened without judgment, shared her own story when appropriate, and offered practical advice based on what she had learned along the way. The bond she formed with these women was profound. They inspired her just as much as she inspired them. Together, they created a community of strength and support, proving that healing was possible even after the darkest times. One particularly memorable evening at the shelter stood out to Emily. A young woman named Sarah, barely in her mid-20s, confided in her about feeling trapped in an engagement she didn't want to follow through with. "I don't know how to say no," Sarah admitted, tears streaming down her face. "Everyone expects me to go through with it. The invitations are sent, the dresses are bought. How can I disappoint everyone?" Emily understood exactly how Sarah felt. She reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You're not disappointing anyone by choosing yourself," she said softly. "A wedding isn't worth sacrificing your happiness or your freedom for. Trust me, I've been there." Over the next hour, Emily walked Sarah through the steps she had taken to reclaim control of her life, encouraging her to seek counseling and lean on supportive friends and family members. By the end of their conversation, Sarah looked less burdened, as though a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Weeks later, Sarah returned to thank Emily, sharing that she had called off the wedding and was finally pursuing a career she had always dreamed of. Stories like Sarah's reinforced Emily's belief that love should never come at the cost of personal dignity. As she continued her work at the shelter, she also began speaking publicly about her experience. Local schools and community centers invited her to share her story, hoping to inspire others to prioritize their well-being and recognize unhealthy dynamics in relationships. At first, Emily hesitated, unsure if she was ready to relive such a vulnerable moment in front of strangers. But with encouragement from her loved ones, she stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding, but her resolve unwavering. The response was overwhelming. Audience members approached her after each talk, thanking her for her honesty and bravery. Many shared their own struggles, seeking guidance or simply wanting to connect with someone who understood their pain. Emily realized that her story had the power to spark change, not just in individuals but in the broader community. Conversations about consent, boundaries, and mutual respect became more open and normalized, breaking down stigmas that had long prevented people from speaking up. Back at the courthouse, Justice of the Peace Harold Simmons watched these developments with quiet pride. Though he rarely saw Emily anymore, he heard updates about her progress through mutual acquaintances. It warmed his heart to know that his intervention had set her on a path toward healing and growth. His own role in the events remained a topic of discussion among townsfolk, with opinions divided between those who praised him and those who questioned his methods. But Harold didn't dwell on the criticism. Instead, he used the incident as a teaching moment, reminding himself and others that integrity mattered more than popularity. Harold's reputation grew beyond the courthouse walls. People began approaching him not only for legal advice but also for personal counsel. He became known as someone who could be trusted to listen without bias and offer thoughtful guidance. Young couples planning weddings often sought his input, asking for tips on building healthy, respectful relationships. Harold welcomed these interactions, seeing them as opportunities to foster understanding and prevent similar situations from arising in the future. Meanwhile, rumors about David occasionally surfaced around town. Some claimed he had moved to another state and started over, while others whispered that he had fallen into old patterns, repeating the same behaviors with new partners. Whatever the truth, he remained a distant memory for Emily, a chapter closed and left behind. She refused to let bitterness toward him define her life, choosing instead to focus on forgiveness and moving forward. As autumn arrived, painting the town in hues of gold and crimson, Emily celebrated her first anniversary of independence, a milestone she marked privately with close friends and family. They gathered at her favorite park, where laughter echoed through the crisp air and homemade desserts were shared under a canopy of colorful leaves. It was a celebration unlike any other, a tribute to resilience, growth, and the beauty of starting anew. Looking ahead, Emily dreamed of possibilities she had once dismissed as unrealistic. She enrolled in art classes, reigniting her childhood passion for painting. Her canvases reflected her journey, vivid colors representing hope, bold strokes symbolizing strength, and soft textures embodying vulnerability. One day, she hoped to host an exhibition showcasing her work, using it as a platform to raise awareness about domestic abuse and relationship dynamics. For Harold, the incident served as a reminder of the profound impact even small acts of integrity could have. He continued his work with renewed purpose, knowing that every decision he made carried weight. Whether officiating weddings, settling disputes, or simply offering words of wisdom, he approached each task with the same guiding principle. Justice wasn't just about fairness, it was about compassion and humanity. In the end, the Halted wedding became more than just a local story. It became a testament to the power of standing up for oneself and listening to one's instincts. It showed that sometimes saying no is the bravest thing you can do. And for Emily, it marked the beginning of a life built on authenticity, self-love, and boundless potential. As she gazed at the horizon, watching the sun dip below the hills, she smiled, knowing that brighter days lay ahead.